Hey, everybody, Pastor Scott here, and we are back for another lesson here for confirmation. A couple of things that I want to say right up here at the beginning. First of all, just a reminder that we are moving back towards in-person class. We will be starting that in a few weeks on the 14th of February. So this weekend, we've got this lesson. Next week, we'll have that lesson, and then we'll be moving into back to in-person. So that is coming up, but we got a couple more lessons in this format before we get there. That is the first thing. The second thing that I'm going to give you today is a disclaimer. Today, we are doing what is my absolute favorite lesson of the entire biblical narrative set that we will go through. I know I've said before, this is one of my favorites. This one is my favorite. So I am going to try and keep myself as under wraps as possible. You'll notice that I probably get really excited about things, and I will try to not go haywire. And I will also do my best to try and keep this as brief as I can. I know these have certainly gotten longer than what we had ever anticipated when this whole deal started. But there we go. So I will try and keep things as under wraps as possible. In today's lesson, I am going to try and utilize the computer to show you some different pictures and slides and stuff. Hopefully that continues to work well. If not, I guess we'll make do, but that is kind of what I'm hoping for in that format. So we'll have some visuals to go along with things. First thing I want you to do as normal is go ahead and put me on pause, and you will do your highs and lows together along with the opening prayer, which I will include in the email as I normally do. So put me on pause and do that. Okay. To recap, when we left off last time, we left off with many of the Israelites or Jewish people. Remember, Jewish comes from Judah, the kingdom of Judah. So that they were returning after the Babylonian exile. They rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. They begin to resettle into the area as well. For the most of the history from that point forward, they are never self-governed again. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, which we have talked about before. There's a very brief period, about 100 or so odd years before Jesus is around, when there was a revolt and they are self-governed for a little while, but that does not last very long. And then in addition to that, actually starting in 1940 or the late 1940s, Israel as a nation has been self-governed again. So they've been an independent nation that way. But basically, they haven't been self-governed for any of the rest of the history. So it's only been a very recent adjustment for that. From where we left off last week, we're going to fast forward today about 530 years. Of that 530 years, the prophets have been silent for about 400 of them, meaning that God has seemingly been quiet for about 400 years. Now, during this time, the people hold on to hope and the promise of God to send a great deliverer who will lead them out of oppression for 400 years. Does that sound like something we've heard before? 400-year period where they're crying out for deliverance? Seems like something we heard back in Exodus. Okay, with that in mind, opening question. Out of all the stories that we have talked about so far, up to this point, throughout the Old Testament anyway, who do you consider to be the best example of a deliverer? What character? And God doesn't count. Go ahead and record that. All right. With that, today we are going to wade into the New Testament, and Jesus now takes on that role of great deliverer. New Testament starts with Matthew chapter 1, which I am open to in my Bible right here. Now, that doesn't show up real good. This is the Old Testament here, this whole section. This smaller section, which again isn't showing up as well, that's the New Testament. You can see one side's way bigger than the other side. And this is what we've gone through so far. So there is a ton that we have skipped over. We've had 11 classes. You think we can cover that whole thing? No, big no. We've skipped over a lot. There's some really good stuff in there. There's also some really weird stuff in there, and there's some really disturbing stuff in there. I'm going to be honest, there's some weird stuff throughout all of the Bible, but in the Old Testament as well. But there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of good stuff. There's a lot of not so good stuff. It's kind of like life, right? It's a mix of the good and the bad all together. Okay. Moving into the New Testament now. Now, the major individual at the focal point is, of course, Jesus. We have the four Gospels. Then we have the book of Acts, in which the disciples kind of take on a bit more of a central role. And then we've got some letters towards the end that talks about kind of Christian life and things that are going on in that. But Jesus is really the focal point. And the cool thing about Jesus is, even if we don't really understand this, Jesus is both God and human all at the same time. What? Mind blowing, crazy. It's weird. But think about it. How does a human being enter the world? They're born, right? Right. That's our story for today. Now, we just heard this story about a month ago at Christmas time. So it should be fairly fresh in your minds if you're thinking about it. So here's what I want you to do to start. You're going to put me on pause here in just a second. And I want you to write down or record just basically your recollection of the Christmas story, of the birth of Jesus. Like, what do you remember? What are the major points? Like, what happened? Just write that down. I want you to record that. That'll be something that you send to me. So go ahead and do that. Okay, now in the end, when we get all the way through, it probably looks something like, where's it at? Oh, share, there we go. Like this, right? Let me move myself out of the way. Like this, right in here, we've got the nativity story. We've got all the shepherds and the sheep, and it's a nice barn, and there's an angel there, and we got the magi and a poinsettia, right? And with a star, all of that cool stuff. That's what we ultimately get to, right? Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, I like it. Okay, let's see. Stop sharing right there. Okay, we're back to me. So, oh, got it. Flip my page over. All right. Now, the birth of Jesus within the scriptures, it's actually found in two different gospels. Now, it's not present in all four, but it's present in Matthew and it's present in Luke. Now, Luke has the most detail, and that's the one that that we hear on Christmas, and that's what we'll also focus on today. So I want you to start in Luke chapter 2, and we're going to start with verses 1 through 2. But before you do, of course, there's Luke chapter 1. So what happens in Luke chapter 1? Well, that's kind of more introduction. We hear about the angel appearing to make the proclamation to the parents of John the Baptist, as well as to Mary, the announcement of both of these two individuals who will be so important. The angel appears to them, and then we actually hear about the birth of John the Baptist. So that's what happens in Luke chapter 1. And now we pick up at Luke chapter 2. So go ahead and put me on pause and read that. Okay, so these two verses tell us who is the current emperor and who is the governor of this area. So if we look through historical documents, we can approximate a date for when this happens. So we see from the get-go, Luke is placing this event at a specific point in history, which is a good reminder for us that this is an actual event that happened. It's not just some great story. It's not just some wonderful myth. This is something that happened at a specific point in history. Okay, go ahead and now read verses 3 through 5. Put me on pause and read that. All right. So we hear everyone has to register. The emperor says so. They have to go to their hometown, their ancestral home, and register. Now, Joseph and Mary, along with him, have to go to Bethlehem because Joseph is of the house of David. Now, think about David. David was a king, right? And then his son took over, and then gradually after that, then there was the dividing of the kingdoms, and we had the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, they're around Judah, Jerusalem, and so his descendants continue to be kings as long as there were kings. So think about this, if Joseph is of the house of David, that means he's of the royal line. He's a royal. Maybe he wasn't a king himself, but he was a royal. Interesting. Tuck that away in the back of your minds. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Yeah, it's crazy. Yep. Okay, let's move on. Go ahead and read verses 6 and 7. All right, here we are told that Jesus is actually born, but there's not a lot of detail. We know that they're in Bethlehem when it happens, that he's wrapped in cloths, and he's laid in a manger. Why? Why was Jesus laid in a manger? Well, it's right there in the narration, because there was no place for them in the inn. Interesting. Now, what did we just learn about Joseph? He's of the royal line, right? He's kind of an important family. You telling me that if a descendant of David showed up, they can't find a place for him to go? I don't buy it. Let's go to the original language. I'm going to show you something here. This will be great. You'll like this. Okay, and share. And we need to go to slide 30. Okay, I got to zip forward. Give me just a second here. Okay, here we go. Right here. You can see this first line, right? Under where it says, open the Bible. It's plain as day. Disto ok el altos potos ento katalamatai. Plain as day, right? It's right there. I mean, you read classical Greek, right? Oh, you don't. Okay, well, you know what? Let's break that down for you. Think Yoda now, the way Yoda speaks. You know how Yoda talks all like backwards and everything? Here's the literal translation of that Greek. Because not there was to them a place in the lodging place. Yeah, okay, that's still kind of weird. So let's clean it up. Mary laid the baby in the manger because there was no place for them in the house. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. Inn is a completely different Greek word. So when we say there was no place for them in the inn, that's not actually accurate. They laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the dwelling place, in the house. But to really understand this, we have to have some idea of like what a house looked like. So I'm going to show you a little map here. Essentially, this is what many first century Palestinian homes looked like. You would have the entryway where you would come in. And then there would be this area where you would keep the animals because their climate is I mean, there's differences, but they experience winter just like we do. So when it gets cold, you need to bring your animals inside so they don't freeze to death. So when you would come into the entryway, you would have this little stable area. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving or not. Hopefully you can. But you would have this stable area, basically just this lower entry area where the animals would come in. And then you would have stairs that would go up into the living space, into the family living space. And if you think about the type of animals they would have sheep, they would have donkeys, things of that nature. They would put the manger, which is basically the feed trough, at this other level right here. So they would stand down lower and they could eat there. It's just off to the side. And then there were different rooms, which would be the actual places where people would stay. That's kind of off the main house. So imagine this. They're in this house, which is not huge, and they would all be together in this family living place, this kind of communal little space in the middle. And that's where Mary has Jesus, where Jesus is born. And there's nowhere else to put him. So they lay him in the manger because it's just right there. So are you starting to kind of picture what this whole thing looks like? I hope you are. Now, this next one I'm going to show you right here, this might be even more helpful for understanding things. So this picture I actually took in Israel, and this is from Nazareth. So this is like Mary and Joseph's hometown and where Jesus would have been raised. Now, what you can see here, you can see a little cave in the background, and then you can see those two pillars in there. Those two pillars would not have been normal during Jesus' time. They were added later on during this excavation. Now, then you can see up here, there's this flat spot. That is the dwelling place right there. And then right here, there's stairs to the front where they would come in. And then you can see there's walls built up. And then the walls would have been built up higher, like with sticks and mud and such. And now this is just one spot in this whole town. Now, Nazareth, here's an important distinction. Nazareth was a very poor town, a very, very poor community. And there was about 100 of these caves in this area, this very, very small area. And the caves were natural. And the caves, that's what we would call the stable. If you can kind of see some stuff down in here, they would have built different things up, but that's where they put their animals. They put them, so they would lead them down through here, put them down in this lower spot. And so right up here along the edge is where they would have laid Jesus, kind of right in this area. So this whole thing is not very big. This entire thing is maybe about 10 feet across from corner to corner. So it's not large at all. What they would have been in Jerusalem, or excuse me, in Bethlehem, Bethlehem was a little bit more affluent, more like we might say middle class. So the structure would have been a little bit bigger, but it's the same general concept in terms of a living space. So hopefully that kind of helps you begin to picture what this would be. Okay, let's see. Now I'm going to stop sharing. All right, we're back to me. Okay, now I want you to look at verses 8 through 14. So go ahead and put me on pause and read that. All right, now we have the story of the shepherds, right? So the Savior of the world has just been born, and the shepherds get the message from the angel. Now, here's a way to think about this. What is the worst job you can imagine? The absolute most horrible, worst, lowliest job you can imagine having? Do you tend to think of the person who has that job as being trustworthy? Maybe not. I don't know. Now, granted, I think all work is good. All jobs are good, but we probably have this bias built into us that the people who do the lousy jobs, man, well, maybe they're not the greatest. Same deal here. Shepherds had that distinction. They were kind of the lowliest of the low, but they are the ones who received this amazing message. It's that same old story, that same old concept or theme that we keep having, that God uses the unexpected person. Now, angel gives them evidence. Basically says, unto you a child is born who will be the savior. He is the Christ, the Lord, or Messiah of the Lord. And the evidence that the angel gives them that the Messiah has been born is that they're going to go find a baby that's been born. Isn't that funny? The evidence to you that the Messiah has been born is that the Messiah has been born. Strange, 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 strange. Okay, 15 through 20. Go ahead and read that. All right. So the shepherds go and they check it out. They find exactly what the angel had told them, exactly what the angel said is they were going to find. They found. They interacted with Mary and Joseph and whoever else was in the house, and then they leave and they go back to the fields. And everyone they encounter, everyone they talk to, they tell what has happened. That is the story. Now, here's a follow-up question to you. Based on what we've now just read, how does that compare to what you had written down at the beginning when you were just thinking about the story and you wrote that down? How do they compare? Go ahead and record that. What are some of the differences that you noticed? Are there details that seem to be missing? Did you notice anyone who was not there who maybe should be, like maybe the wise men that we always look for? The wise men are actually found in a completely different gospel. Remember, we're in Luke's gospel. They're found in Matthew chapter 2, and they actually show up way after Jesus is born. Some people think like upwards of 2 years after he was born. So they are not there, even though all of our nativity scenes always have the wise men in them. This points out something that we oftentimes, I think, take for granted, that we get these stories in our heads and in our minds, and we sort of think these are the aspects that are present. This is what's part of the story, even though the scripture doesn't always support that. And this is one of a perfect example. Now, interestingly enough, here's another little detail. Maybe you picked up on this and maybe you didn't. Jesus is not actually even named Jesus in this story. Now, he's referenced as being called Jesus when the angel shows up to Mary back in chapter 1. And actually, right after this, he will be called by name. But during the entire birth narrative, the birth of Jesus, he's never named Jesus. Isn't that nuts? Oh, it's just so strange, but it makes me really, really happy. Now, let's think about the things that the story does tell us. We learn that the Messiah is born at a specific point in history. We learn that the first witnesses to this story, other than his parents and the people who were in the house, are the shepherds, the lowliest of the low. Interestingly enough, this whole thing was forecast way in advance. Back in Isaiah, Isaiah is one of the prophets, one of the major prophets. We talked about that. In Isaiah 9:2, we hear, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who live in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. Now, who might that sound like? I'm going to share something else with you here. Show you something else that I want you to look at right here. Okay. Kind of sounds like the shepherds. Now, this picture right here, this is another picture that I took when I was in Israel a few years ago. This is a mural that is found in a chapel that's at the shepherd's field. It's the point or the spot out just outside of Bethlehem, thought to be where the shepherds would have encountered the angel, or more so the other way around, where the angel encountered the shepherds. You can kind of see how this great light, this glory of God that shone around all of them while they're in the midst of darkness is there. Kind of a cool picture. I sort of like it. Okay, so there's actually a lot of prophecy. Remember, Isaiah is a prophet, which we just talked about. There's a lot of prophecy within the Old Testament that seems to point at Jesus if we look for it. However, it is worth mentioning, I think it's important to mention, that we see this. We kind of spot evidence of prophecies aiming at Jesus. Sorry, I gotta wipe my nose a little bit. Because we look at things through the lens of Christianity. We expect all of this to be all tied together so we can read these things and interpret that as pointing towards Jesus. However, it's important to remember that the Old Testament, or as we've called it before, the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Scriptures, is originally Jewish scripture, right? We need to acknowledge that the Jewish understanding of things about the Messiah are not pointing at Jesus. Now, it's good for us to remember that they are people of a different faith, that the Jewish faith is not like pre-Christian, or it's not like something that will lead into Christianity. It is a separate faith practice. Now, do we have things in common? Yes, we do. But do we have things that are different? Yes, we do. So if we were to say to a Jewish person, look in your scriptures and see how they point to Jesus, they would not agree with us. And I just want to acknowledge that it's important that we respect the faith tradition and the faith understanding of a different faith tradition. Cool? Cool. All right. I want you to now think, as we're wrapping this up, think about this cycle that we continue to see. Humanity falls away from God. They cry out to God for deliverance. God provides it. Only this time, in this story, what we see differently now is that God is actually doing something about the cycle itself. Somehow, in ways that go beyond our understanding, through Jesus, God is somehow fixing this cycle. All right, closing questions, everybody. What is the weirdest thing that we talked about today? And what's the strangest thing that we talked, or maybe most surprising thing? And then any questions or comments or concerns that you have. Thanks for tuning in. I know this was a lot. It's a fun story. I dig it. We'll talk to you later.